It's
Sure.
and YouTube. Yeah,
That's unhelpful.
yeah.
And then we can put this there. And now you have it, you can do what you.
Are we gonna have people go on an IRC channel? I guess, can they talk on the Hangout on there?
No, they can't.
No. What channel do we want people to go to? Okay.
You can still invite people, can you?
Yeah, and
Yeah, but-
so
Can
can
you just like, yeah, I can just paste it in there and make myself an example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Such as like, just paste it in the,
Okay.
Okay,
You probably want to share screen.
yeah. Okay,
And then click on.
paste it in the,
Hello.
hello. Who do we got? Okay, awesome.
Okay. So,
all right,
Sorry about that.
that was fun.
Yeah.
Here, you want to keep these controls in place where they actually work?
not really, but
Well, it shouldn't take you just where I sit.
All right, so let's get back to the discussion. So we're just looking into over the content platform, giving an overview. So the main challenges are kind of in the storage area. Having very structured content is kind of covered by Wikidata. And we have less structured content, which would be things like citations and page properties that show a table of contents, things that basically are not facts that belong in Wikidata, but and possibly also need to be updated when the page is edited. So they need to be synced. There's challenges there with syncing this with Wikitext, for example, as long as we use Wikitext as the main storage format. And finally, we have all the really very unstructured content that is just paragraphs of text and so on. That's not going to go away. So we need to store all those things, and those interact in interesting ways. And that brings us to change propagation, because we now have, once we decompose things into all this metadata and so on, we want to reintegrate it, and there's challenges about pushing stuff from Wikidata to the info box and then to the pages that use the info box. There is challenges in keeping metadata that is derived from a page in sync with Wikitext edits, and there's a lot more. And on the Etherpad, there's actually a couple of use cases that focus on these two, or try to tease out what the challenges are in these two main areas of storage and change propagation or dependency management. Finally, there's one area that is not yet very well covered in the use cases, and that's content composition and caching. It is basically the same area, except that we have some use cases that are more dynamic potentially. So we have currently we don't have a generic way to say this is a bit of info box that is embedded in a page, and this is a generic way how this could be updated. And in the longer term, it's conceivable that we would want to do this updating in a more efficient way than re-rendering the entire page from scratch, which we do right now. And instead, update just that part of the page that needs to be changed, and maybe do it even in the cache on the edge in Amsterdam, or even in the browser if it's very dynamic. And so there's challenges around templating, for example. Wikitext templating is not very well contained right now. It can, if you change the template, it can potentially wrap the remainder of the page. So you can't in general, update just that block of content because it might now encompass the entire page. So if we change that and instead have some kind of generic way to say this is a fragment that needs to be updated, then we might be able to do that on the edge or elsewhere and with less complexity. So the challenge there is finding something that is maybe general so that we don't have to solve the same problem in 10 different ways. And in a way that scales well and integrates well with the change propagation stuff. So for this meeting, I would personally gather some input on what your use cases and challenges are in this area, and also whether you feel that this is the area that you actually see as the most pressing. And maybe we could have a look at a few use cases and see if there's others that you can come up with. I think that could be a good starting point to actually working out all these issues. So we don't, I think, right now have a complete solution to all this. It's a very big topic. And I would expect us to work on this for a while and incrementally find solutions to these things, and something will emerge in the discussion. But I think a good starting point is to figure out what are we trying to solve, which are the issues that we see in practice right now, and then start from there. And I could see this develop into a working group, basically, of people who are interested in that space, ideally with representation from all the teams who have issues in that area. And then we can meet every now and then and continue working this out. And there's some work ongoing already in that space for the next quarter at least, that we start, for example, services. We want to look into the change propagation bit a little bit. But yeah, it's very early days. So on the Etherpad, further down, there's a section with use cases. If you look at them, there's one for graph weight graphs. That is a discussion we had recently with Yuri. There's a couple of issues there. He's currently storing those graphs in page properties, but it's hitting the size limitations. I think it's 60K or so. 60K. Yeah. So yeah, basically very large graph definitions don't fit into page properties. And so some alternative needs to be found there. And
in template data, we gzip the data before putting it in, which gives us about 200K's worth of space.
Okay.
For JSON, not that I'm recommending you do that either, but no problem. We should probably put that as a use case.
Yeah, it's further down actually in Visual Editor.
Oh yeah.
There's a template editor. There's a you had the request to put up potentially version them independently. Back to graphs. Change propagation has challenges there. Basically, if the data changes, all the graphs that use the data need to be updated. And currently, that's kind of done in my opinion, slightly hacky way by transcluding the data into the definition. So it's actually transcluding JSON into other JSON, and then having one big JSON blob that is then rendered. And basically, it requires the entire page to be re-rendered every time the data changes. And that is okay for most use cases, but if we had something that's more dynamic, that would not work so very well. Yes.
Actually, Gabriel?
Yeah?
How about just tracking the usage like a transclusion without actually transcluding it on a syntactic level? So basically put it into template links.
Yeah, that would be definitely better than actually transcluding it. It's just right now the path of least resistance is to just hook into that transclusion mechanism and basically get this dependency tracking for free. Right? So I think that hints at that it's really important that we make this dependency tracking and keeping those dependencies updated very easy, because otherwise, if that is very hard to do, then whatever is easier will be used. And it's actually pretty hard. So if you look at the parser and the code that keeps track of what are the outgoing links, and then diffs them against the previous versions of links, and then updates, performs the queries that inserts the ones that need to be inserted and removes the ones that need to be removed. It's not actually so simple, especially if you wanted to do it on a case-by-case basis. So this kind of thing, you probably have to come up with some interface that lets you just give a list of dependencies and then have automatically have all this diffing and so on be done automatically in some way.
Is change propagation, maybe I missed it, but is change propagation a deal outside of the fact that you have to re-render the entire page? Like, are there other consequences?
Well, there's two parts to it. One is tracking the dependencies, so you actually know what you have to update. And the second is organizing the update in a way that is reliable and scalable, and ideally somewhat efficient. So right now, when you edit some of these templates that are used in 8 million pages, it can create a huge backlog in our job queue, and it can slow other updates down. And it doesn't really scale very well, so we discourage people from updating these things. And but it still causes issues. And really, in most cases, in the parse rate updates, we have seen that in about half of these template updates, the content doesn't even change on the string level. So most of these template re-renders, even if you re-render the entire page, doesn't change anything at all. But we have a lot of server resources and database resources be used on updating all this stuff, and it's not very fast.
Okay.
And if we wanted to have more dynamic parts of pages, which might be attractive for some features, we would have to be very careful about how we do that. Right now, we basically can't do that without disabling caching for the entire page. We can't just embed something that is dynamic into something that's very well cached. And, yeah, that's a challenge.
I think as long as you are talking about wiki on this about content on the same wiki, you can use the template links mechanism. But as soon as stuff goes cross-wiki, as soon as you reuse content from somewhere else, especially from another wiki, you kind of have to re-implement the entire thing. And having a generic mechanism that would work for Wikidata or for, I don't know, global modules or global templates or global user pages and so on, including image changes, all that stuff that is currently has special case implementations, having a generic mechanism for that would be a great help.
Yeah, we can either go further through these use cases and see if they cover all the things that you have in mind, or are there any other proposals or what to focus on? An alternative would be to go through start discussing possible ways to address this, but I think at this point in this group, I think it would be more useful to get your input on what you want to see solved. General agreement?
Yeah. This is Corey. One of the things I think is pretty important that we've been running up against when thinking about implementing our own services is definitely the storage solution. Because it seems like we got all the pieces we need except not a place to store anything. And this is coming up with, right now we've been talking about lead image type stuff, like if we want to like tag what a lead image is, and like you know, whether that goes in Wikidata or whether it goes in Commons, and there's been this like back and forth about like where it goes. And of course, if we could just stand up our own service real quick and just have a place to store that, we wouldn't need to worry about it. I mean, maybe that's not the right solution, but at least it would be a solution we could talk about if like we had a place to store it.
We had a few discussions actually with services about this kind of thing, and right now the bit that we are missing is a way to update this stuff. Basically, whenever we store something, we have to make sure that we have some way to invalidate it. So either the URLs have to be self-invalidating by having some kind of revision in there, or a hash of something, or we have to organize the dependency tracking and this update process somehow. And for a couple of things that we're currently working on, we basically have to implement this dependency tracking and update system. The app service would be a good example for that, where we want to pre-generate new content whenever either a Wikidata summary of an article, for example, is modified, or if the article itself is modified. And possibly others. I haven't actually checked yet which other things you pull in there in the metadata.
I had a hello.
Oh, go ahead.
So what happens? How is this being handled right now? So suppose there are all these really old Wikitext revisions, and the PHP parser, for example, has had bugs fixed over time. So how do you really view the really old content that may not render identically? And so how is something like this going to be handled in the future as well? I think that's something to consider as well when we talk about content storage.
If we re-rendered it now with the current parser or parser read, would it still be faithful to how it looked back then?
That is a question.
Yeah, I think it has been pretty stable. I mean, there have been bug fixes, but I don't think there has been. I'm not aware of any major changes in the syntax that would completely break old revisions. So, and then I think what also helped is that the wiki text back then was a lot more limited and simple, because most of the complex features that we've added since did not exist. There were no templates. There were no. The images were there, but not with all the functionality that we have now.
So the reason I ask also is because say let's we switch to Parsoid for rendering new HTML going forward at some point. So what do we do about all the old revisions that may not render identically with Parsoid? And what does it mean for all the functionality that exists for? So do we kind of render all the old HTML with the PHP parser, which also means that it won't have all the markup that's required for viewing. Tools that rely on Parsoid markup may not have that information with the PHP HTML. So there is some kind of a split here. I'm just trying to figure out that's something that we need to resolve. I just want to bring it up, not necessarily solve it here, but I'm just raising it. I cannot hear the office at all. Is it only me or somebody else?
Sorry?
Go ahead.
We haven't done any tests on that, but I think I'm quite optimistic that we can actually, if there's issues, solve them in a way that makes the old content accessible in a good enough fashion. I think most of those changes are fairly minor. Maybe we can table that issue and look into it separately, because that is to me, that's a very interesting topic. The content storage, what is the, oh, somebody can't hear anything? Are we muted? Can you hear us generally?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Yeah, what is the long-term, if we're talking about long-term content storage, whether that should be HTML, possibly with Parsoid HTML now having all the semantic data in there. But I think we can table that for a little bit longer. I think if we don't have to, we will never have a point where we just switch off wiki text and say from now on it's only HTML. We'll coexist, continue to coexist for quite a long time, I think. So we are not, I think that's not a question we have to decide right now. but we can work towards that. I think if we can, that could be something that comes out of this discussion in the or this group, is that we maybe come up with a roadmap of where we see us 5 years from now. So fairly long term. We are moving in that direction, but it's not going to be overnight, for example. And we have that question in the context of new features. Are we building them on top of Parse HTML, for example? And that is kind of incrementally making this decision the more we build on top of it. So at some point, it might make sense to have a clear decision. This is how we plan to do it, and these are the remaining issues that we have to address. And this is how we plan to address them. But yeah, I don't. If that is something that is holding up projects right now, I think then we should bring it up. But I don't see anything major right now. Should we go back to the use cases? So in Flow, I'm not actually sure. Roman, you might be able to say more about that. This is what I wrote down from memory. It's
Yeah, I also don't understand the Flow backend completely, but I do know that apparently the people designing it were told not to create a page for every post the way Liquid Threads did, and so they didn't. But now we have a lot of problems relating to the fact that posts aren't real pages according to MediaWiki, and so a lot of things are difficult because like everything to do with recent changes, history, link tables, all that kind of stuff, that all has to be maintained separately because you can't use, if MediaWiki doesn't believe that a post is like an entity, but it only believes that a topic is an entity, then how do you delete individual posts or have history for individual posts or oversight individual replies or that kind of stuff? So my understanding is that we have some sort of model that where we sort of model things at a lower level of granularity, and then MediaWiki does understand like the topic namespace, but everything is stored separately. All the link table, all the dependency tracking, all the everything is done by ourselves, so that we know what comes from where, and that results in a lot of bugs because this stuff isn't easy, and we didn't implement it perfectly because it is hard, and it's actually kind of silly that we're implementing it twice, right? Because MediaWiki already has it, and that stuff works. And
why were they advised against doing Liquid Threads long?
I don't know by whom or why.
Performance.
I think something performance something, but I don't.
Interesting.
I think part of the problem was that the storage backend used by MediaWiki is kind of inflexible, right? Everything goes to the same backend store. Becoming more flexible about where and how content blobs are stored would perhaps help to solve that. Another approach I would have tried to explore with respect to Flow would have been to store each conversation as one page object and have it contain structured data that represents the individual thread structure and the individual posts. But yeah, I guess that's a bit beyond the conversation right now. Yeah,
so that's actually exactly what we do. Internally, it's JSON, I believe, and we use Content Handler, not as well as we should, but we use Content Handler to a certain extent. So we actually do have every conversation, every topic is a page with like special Content Handler and stuff. But the fact remains that a lot of the things that we have to do are at the granularity level of a post or of a reply, and that concept doesn't exist as far as MediaWiki is concerned. The highest granularity concept that MediaWiki understands is the conversation, and that is a problem when you are allowing users to edit their own replies but not those of others, or if you are saying like, I want to oversight the history of like this one really offensive comment. Those kinds of things would require surgical operations on like subparts of that structured data, and so instead of doing that, we have, I don't know what exactly, we have other things.
added some of this on the pad.
But yeah, you have post level addressing is a good one. You have post level everything really, like access rights, history, redaction of history, but also addressing for the purposes of link tables. Like if you're like, oh, like what links to like this person's user page, and you find that there's like, like this discussion on like, there's like a request for adminship, and it's like turning into like a giant mud fest, and everyone's slaying mud at everybody else, and there's like one discussion that has like 1,000 posts in it, and somewhere in there, someone linked to this page that I'm interested in, but now I have no way of digging deeper than that because the link tables only understand titles, and titles only go as far as topics. I believe we actually do have post-level granularity for link metadata because we implemented it ourselves, but it doesn't work very well. So Tim writes in the chat, the concern of the flow team was that there was no way to load pages in batches, which yes, you would have to do. My response was just add that thing coordinates complicated. I generally agree with that, but I was not in those discussions at the time, so I know very little about it.
That's a lot of things already.
Yeah, sorry. Well, our code is messy. Yeah, transclusion HTML not being updated is another one. That's an HTML storage format issue.
I think in these sort of complex situations, I mean, you have so many different ways that people want to store and access the information that you're not going to find a unified theory. Instead, you're going to find like a few different averages that tend to be adaptable enough. And so, like, I think it's just like an important thing with building like an architecture, like, sort of moving toward an architecture, is to not assume there will be a unified theory of how all things should be stored and retrieved, but instead that there are like some classifications of use cases which are then sort of built out in ways that are adaptable enough.
Or add the ability to add new categories.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, I agree. I think if we just design around the existing use cases, we will miss some. And so we should make sure that we build these pieces so that they are not really limiting us unnecessarily to what we do right now.
Yeah.
But,
so, like, as for like the immediate issues in the flow case, for instance, like things that suggest to me that might be needed are a way for pages to exist in some sense, either without being in the page table or adding the ability to have a sharded page table. Because, I think you should be able to have millions and millions of titles that conceptually exist, but aren't necessarily all tracked in the same table. What Daniel said about storage, being able to shard storage, we would probably also want to be able to shard link table things, which is already a little bit of a problem in Commons because their category links table is enormous. And that's not, that's something I predict will eventually become a problem.
But sharding is, to me, that's more of an implementation question. That's
sure, but it's
mostly hidden.
Right, yes, except that right now we're making architecture decisions based on what the current code can and cannot do.
Yeah.
And so, like, my understanding is that one of the reasons why Flow went the way it did was because there is no sharding of any of this stuff, and that would have caused, like, actual operational problems.
Also, the nastiness of Liquid Threads having to come up with these unique titles.
Oh, we still do that, actually.
I think that's also, like, that exposes another issue, which
Machine ID support.
But yeah, like, the primary key should be a machine ID, and the uniqueness of titles in a namespace should be something that's configured and enforced by software, not necessarily by the database.
All right, that's a whole discussion. I guess we can continue for a while. So should we move on to the app service? Bernd, or?
Yes, please. I don't know who wrote some of the stuff about caching, but that's pretty good too. In terms of what we're going to do initially, we're basically going to move the transforms that we currently have on the client to the service. So we have a consistent view, consistent implementation, and we can actually also better support older clients. There's a bunch of we're still supporting Android 2.3, and there's some really low-powered Android devices, and that have a real hard time doing all this DOM transformations on there. And the main goal is actually also basically to improve the page load speed and to also reduce the payload, reduce the amount of requests that we're making to load a page, and to reduce the burden on the clients, and also to help us by us developers to make us move faster, also by moving code to a common service instead of having to implement everything twice. Yeah, that's sort of the general idea. Okay, Gebra, I cannot hear you. You're muted.
Go ahead. So on the in the storage part, that the requirement is basically around basic HTML storage, cache control, API issues, and then change propagation, I guess, is probably the heart of it. With
yeah, and actually storage, I should mention, we have two routes currently. One is the HTML route, and then we have also another light route that we're developing too, which is a longer-term play for us to even better support low-end devices, so we can actually have everything rendered natively instead of rendered in a web view. The web view is just a very processor and memory-hungry beast, which old clients cannot, old devices cannot deal that well with.
A few events like HTML has changed. For change propagation, there's a few events that you need to react to. One is the a page was edited, or a template was modified and is updated inside an article. And then you're pulling in Wikidata, media. This is for the lead image, I guess.
We're using page images for the lead images right now, but yeah, that could change. For mainly what we're using Wikidata for is the description right now. We don't necessarily need to change or propagate changes from everything in Wikidata because we're only using a very small subset. So I don't want us to like have to churn our cache if it doesn't actually even affect anything. So currently we're only using the description.
Our goal is to expand on that.
Yeah. Well, I guess so, but you would probably still be very targeted, as in only update if the description was edited, not if there's any change to the item.
Exactly, it would be some subset. Yeah.
So that's a challenge that has to be targeted to just a part of the Wikidata item.
Bernd, I had a question. Going back to Tim Starling's comment, it sounds like most of what you talked about is just a sort of alternate representation of the wiki text source. So this isn't a sort of additional information that has to be stored. It's just something that you want to cache for performance reasons. But I think lead image is potentially different because that's actually a different piece of information. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Some of the part is massaging the content to make it look differently. but then also, yeah, we're pulling in the lead images, and yeah, we'd like to also streamline how we do that, and just have the service act as provide a simple way for the apps to access it without having to pull in data from different API requests. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
I think so. I'm still. I mean, is it an actual piece of information? You know, what the lead image is that would be stored separately from the canonical wiki text of the article? I think is the key question.
But that's actually further down, and there's this command at the top of the mobile app service section to move down to the readership section, and that starts with lead images.
Okay, so we'll talk about it later then. Fine.
Should we just move there? The comments. So in lead images, I think what you were getting at is that this is a new type of content that is not stored elsewhere, so it would no longer be kind of a cache. But at that point, this bit of information would be the only place where it's stored, basically. Somebody has designated this is the image that.
Yeah, that's the question. You know, does it live in the? Does it get propagated back to the canonical wiki text of the article, or is it we're actually storing separate bits of information about articles that have to be managed?
So we've talked about like storing in the wiki text just as a means of providing editors with tools to change the lead image, but I don't know if that's ultimately going to be the easiest place to pull that information from.
Right now, it's not stored in either the wiki text or the HTML. It's retrieved from a totally separate API call, or well, an API module. It's not actually a separate HTTP request, but
like some kind of article metadata, like so like the image might be an example, but in general, like some kind of way of like associating additional information with a page and saying like this is like a lead image, or this is like some other new concept we've dreamed up that needs to be associated with the article and doesn't necessarily get changed by the wiki text. It might do, but
yeah, I guess that's a philosophical question. If we want to, in the long run, always have an equivalent in wiki text and always just extract it from there, or if we actually start to move some information like metadata to a separate bit of storage. And historically, we only had one blob, so we had to put everything to wiki text. And we came up with syntaxes for categories and all kinds of things that don't actually render, and where it doesn't really matter where you put it in the page, like no talk or something like that. There's conventions around it so that the wiki text remains readable. But I think it mostly developed out of having one blob, having the diff tools to show all these changes in one place and so on.
I'll also call out that it's very common to use templates, which are content technology, to insert unrendered things that turn into meta information. So it's not as simple as just like turning into a bunch of checkboxes. That like we're using content technology in weird meta ways.
And not even all those weird meta ways are unreasonable, because it's pretty common to put, like, you know, if you write a citation needed template or something like that, then there's a parameter that it takes. You can tell when you put it there, like, you know, June 2015, and that won't change the visual rendering. It'll still say citation needed, but it'll also put the article in the category articles lacking citations since June 2015. And then next year, in June 2016, someone will go look at a category and, you know, complain, whatever. Which is an entirely useful and legitimate use case, but it's also very annoying if you have a single template that both generates content and metadata at the same time. That's right.
Yeah, but to answer your question about whether or not we always want there to be a wiki text, like to be findable, or whether through transclusion or not, there's going to be things that I think we're going to want that aren't wiki text and editable, such as which parts of the article have been highlighted the most by readers. That's just something that should not exist in wiki text, because nobody should be able to change that number.
Well, the browse tag experiment we're doing at the moment might be a good example of something you might want to associate with an article. So we've so Gather's essentially like building lists around content. So you might want to associate an article with certain URLs on Gather, like certain Gather like lists that or related somehow. So it might be related articles might be a good example. Like,
Those are two separate. There's three separate things. So the thing you're talking about could be generated in time looking at historical information.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not a user contributed thing.
Right. So it's not work. It's more like statistics. It's analytics. Right. And what you're talking about is work, but not the kind of work we would normally store in the page, which is a third case.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And there's two related things a bit further down, which I mean are less. I mean, it's something you guys would probably be interested in at some point, but like editing categories and languages. I've been able to say like remove this category, add a category. That's been like a long requested feature, and that would be something that you might want to store as metadata.
Categories are, of course, falling right into the split between some are dynamically inserted from templates, and some are actually editable in the page. And Visual Editor, we were recently discussing section editing in Visual Editor, and one of the issues there is reference editing, and the other is page metadata. There's already a nice dialog to have kind of page properties, page metadata edited in VE. And
but I assume the hope is to edit like categories outside Visual Editor, like because something like simple like that, like.
Yeah, but for that we will probably continue to provide the functionality that it will basically go back into the wiki text, so you can have the same edit experience that you have in VE, but from a different context. It can be just open from a wiki text editor. You could open the page properties, or you can have a gadget that does it or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking long term, because obviously like Visual Editor on apps is like a long way off, I guess, unless something's changed. It'd be great to have like ways that people can contribute, like through the app, like simple tasks like adding categories. So.
Well, I think that long form editing in a phone needs to not be our only idea for how you're going to contribute using a phone. But at the same time, what he's kind of getting at is, because so much of the information about the page is highly contextual, that whether you're using a long-form editor or not, the core visual editor technology, which takes the entire document after Parsoid, makes some sense of it, makes modifications to it, and sends it back to Parsoid to make some more sense of it, is actually one of the biggest performance hits and one of the biggest technical challenges, which you can't circumvent just by making simpler tools. So like, if you want to edit categories or you want to edit the text, it doesn't matter. You still need to load the entire thing into memory and then edit it and then send the whole thing back. That's status quo. We haven't figured out a way around that. So
yeah, but as we've been recently discussing in the context of section editing, moving more of the logic that is currently in Visual Editor about where to place new categories and so on, all this fun stuff. Move that into Parsoid basically, and so based on that, we could start providing APIs that let you edit a subset of this stuff. But it would still, most of it would still be in the wiki text.
Yeah, you would still, I mean,
in the
Parsoid and REST-based, you still just collaborate to provide a layer on top that like pretend to like mobile visual editor that you can just edit categories, but really what's going on is still.
It's important to remember that wiki text is an interface. It happens to be what we store in right now too, but like that's a technicality. The truth is, Wikitext is an interface that a lot of editors prefer, and even if we add some other feature that's stored somewhere else in the database, we are expected to provide a Wikitext interface for that data.
I would like to chip in there because that is probably true to a large extent, but not entirely. Which I think the experience with Wikidata shows. There is no Wikitext interface for editing Wikidata, and I don't think it would be sensible to try and build one. And it still works quite well. If we now took away the ability to edit categories via Wikitext, yes, that would be a problem. People would not like that. But I think if we start introducing new kinds of concepts or content or new kinds of information that can be stored and edited explicitly by users, it is not necessarily true that that has to be possible via Wikitext. And what I have been thinking about this, especially in the context of metadata about media files, right? The way that metadata is currently maintained on Commons is beyond horrible, and it's not machine readable. if we want content to be human editable, managed in the revision history, and machine readable, then it probably shouldn't be Wikitext, because that will end up not being machine readable. So one of the main questions, I think, is there a need to store more than one content object per revision that is user editable and should be tracked via the page history? I've been thinking about this a little bit. I've been doing some code experiments, and I think it would be extremely useful to have this. But it would be interesting to know if others also think that this would be a useful feature.
The main question is whether if the stuff is still in the Wikitext, or if we actually move the main storage or something out of the Wikitext and it's no longer available there. I guess there's also shades of gray around like how critical something is, but something like lead images might not be considered super critical to the content, and if you do an XML dump, if it's not included in that Wikitext, too bad. But other things might be still very critical. So
so I just want to sort of touch on that. Okay, so one, I didn't say we had to. I said users expect us to. And there's a very big difference between those two things, especially given that we're trying to maintain and build trust with these people. It's probably best for us to take that seriously. I think the other thing is that there is a lot of totally rational argument to be made for why leaving this in a Wikitext interface is good, that we're going to have to argue against. The burden of proof is on us. For instance, the reason that everything being stored in the Wikitext is convenient to these people is because they don't have to look 10 different places to see what changed. If we start storing it somewhere else, then we have to not just store it somewhere else, but we also have to provide a way for them to modify it without JavaScript. We also have to provide a way for them to be notified that it's changed, a way to render the difference between the two states. And we have to manage all of those redaction processes, all that stuff. So we're kind of back to the flow thing, where you reinvent it. You just inherit the exact same problems, and now you're doing it twice. So it's rare that I make an argument for why everything should be in a blob of Wikitext. My point is that no matter where we store it, it is the expectation that the Wikitext interface is still fully functional, even if we're composing it and doing magic to it to produce this artificial interface that looks like Wikitext to the user.
I don't think it's necessary to use Wikitext to have integration with page history, watch list, link tables, and div view. That can be done without Wikitext.
Explain. Of course we could. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I'm saying the burden of proof is on us, and we need to understand the externalities of such a decision. That you're signing yourself up for a whole ton of work to integrate with every single one of those systems, including a whole bunch of other people's systems that are just making the assumption that changes in the Wikitext equate changes in the page. So what I'm trying to express is that you need to tread lightly about making the assumption that it's okay to store it just wherever you like, because there's more than just the fact that it's in the Wikitext or not in the editor. There's a lot of other systems that make assumptions around that.
I think it's probably going to be a very gradual process where we first start to augment existing Wikitext editing with a page property editor that people can use, and where they can get a feel for how could this look if I don't use this. This is actually faster than editing with text. And if they see that and that turns out well and people like it, then we can consider moving more things out. And we can maybe also start storing some things outside of the Wikitext that are not as critical, like maybe the primary image or the focal area within an image. Maybe that makes more sense to store along with the image rather than the page timestamp.
It would be much better for that stuff to be stored in a structured way, because then in the history you could explain that, the lead image has changed rather than there was a diff, right? And there are a lot of benefits to it. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. We have to do this eventually for us to be able to achieve the kind of features that we're all looking to achieve in the next 4 or 5 years. I'm trying to sort of be like the voice of reason. That's this is not going to be easy.
Can I say something about diffs and whatnot? We've already got a hook into diffs in the content handler, right? And Wikidata uses that, and Graphs uses that. We don't like one way that we could do it is just to store categories separately. We could just wrap the whole Wikitext content in some sort of higher level object and serialize that and store a blob, right? Where one member of the JSON blob would be the whole of the Wikitext, and another member of the JSON blob would be the categories. You can serialize that for bots or whatever, and you can present diffs using Content Handler.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That way, we only have to edit what we show to the user. They're only edited part of like what we're actually storing. So we don't actually lose that ability, and then we can leave it up to us to render the other bits that are in structured data. And we do still have those same problems, but at least we're using the existing like Wikitext structure.
Yeah, that kind of multi-part content approach is pretty appealing. It has a few downsides though, and while I was kind of itching to implement that for most of last year, I have moved away from that idea a little bit. So downsides I came across are having it all in one blob means storing it all in the same place. Depending on what content you have and the size of that content, you may actually want to store different things in different places for access performance and storage performance. Also for not diffing entirely different kinds of things against each other. And also a multi-part content would make for strange XML import-export, or it would be a breaking change. Well, that probably can't be avoided. But if you access the content, the revision content via the API, what would you get? The serialized multi-part thing, breaking all clients that expect Wikitext there? I think that's one of the big challenges. And that's actually one of the reasons that I, by now, favor having something like slots or sub-revisions for different parts of content. Yeah. I was hoping to have a proposal ready by today, but sadly I didn't make it.
Daniel, the way I understood Tim was that if we could have a transition technology basically lets us reuse the existing diff functionality while already moving out some bits of content, and by basically concatenating the actual page content with some synthetic page content that looks like Wikitext, and then run the diff over it, so we still get the diff people expect, without necessarily storing it as a blob in the database.
And the HTTP and PHP API have methods and properties that specifically are called like content. So I don't think that there's that much software that's literally reaching into the database table and assuming anything about what's in that particular column. I think we mostly have control over that. Sorry.
So we're basically doing something like mine.
Well, that's kind of what Content Handler already is doing, right? And then this is just like
taking
message. Yeah, but this is taking a little further.
But I think that's kind of a separate discussion how we store it. I think we can store it as separate things that makes it easier to address a part and index it and so on. Or we can use MIME or something like that. But I think that's an orthogonal question to how do we do things.
No, it doesn't have to be MIME, but the same principle. Like you have a blob, and then when you parse it, you actually discover the structure.
Or only assemble it from multiple separate fields when you want to diff it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's also a possibility. That's a big discussion on the entire content thing. Should we move on and see what is on Etherpad? Or any more remarks on that? Let's move on.
I think we beat it to death.
You got 20 more minutes.
Are we done architecting yet?
Use cases. And so I see there's use cases here further down.
For Visual Editor?
No, we're still in the reading huge master block. There's adding, removing categories. I think we covered that. Repositioning, moving, restyling. Actually, in the lead image thing, there's actually an interesting challenge in how this is updated, because there's fairly complex dependencies to, it has to be updated if that image is no longer in the page, probably, because if it's no longer in there, it can't be the lead image, or if the lead image is removed. And so this means that that's a fairly complex case, actually, where you have to look at images inside of a page and then only update this other bits of content if it's removed or added.
If it's not tied to the page itself.
Yeah.
You're referring to like if the properties of the image are independent of the article.
Yeah.
If you assume that it's linked to the article, well, that simplifies everything. You can do that like with cache invalidation and just re-render everything before you send it to the client.
It feels like you're mixing the difference between an explicit image being configured and us having to store that data somewhere, and inferring the lead image from something in the content. Which, if you're inferring it, you just do this automatically as like a post-save hook. Whereas if it's individually configured, then the fact that the image is no longer in the page or may never have been in the page is irrelevant, because somebody did the work to specifically configure it.
I guess if we are working in something like Visual Editor, we could actually solve some of these problems with the editing environment, because it can figure out this was the lead image, it was now removed, we added another one, where now I prompt the user, should this be the lead image or nominate one.
At least showing them what the default's going to be if you don't make a choice, right? Which we do that with other interfaces, like to do with categories, like what's going to be the key if you don't specify, things like that.
Yeah, the same in Wikitext might be harder. If you just remove the former lead image in Wikitext, what should the interaction be? You hit save, you get a dialog.
Yeah, you get it automatically. You get a fallback. Yeah, you just get a fallback. Which, as I said, you just do the post-save hook, so you don't really have to worry about the timing, because you already have this perfect opportunity in the post-save hook to deduce what it should be.
Just how we're currently doing it. We're using the page image extension to do that.
There's a lot of things in there. Still. So.
And you guys end up saving that as like a page prop?
Page images? I think that's how it works.
Something like that.
But the problem is it doesn't store the coordinates. So that's like kind of missing piece, because you can't really infer that. So it varies. Well, I mean, technically you could. We don't right now.
Just some feedback on the lead images I got from the chat was we should also consider whether we want to have restrictions or guarantees about aspect ratio or resolution. So that's another factor, in that UI that we present to the user.
But it sounds like the complexity can be kept out of the update layer mostly and pushed into the user interface, or in some post-save hook that just figures out this is the fallback.
Well,
after service.
It's interesting he said restrictions. Like, let's remember that there's no such thing as invalid wiki text. There's just called plain text. Like if all else fails, and so that's something that we had to remember, that in a wiki text interface there is no error handling because there's no such thing as an error. And so if we introduce in the user interface, you may not do this, then it causes two problems. One is now there's a huge difference in in the model of what is allowed between Wikitext, which everything is allowed, and if you do something stupid, you just get a stupid result. And the user interface where it's literally not allowed. But also that it prevents you from being able to effectively edit something that was put into a not allowed state in Wikitext mode. So we had to be really careful about the idea that certain things are not allowed. That said, I think the user interface can guide people to make better decisions about things, but in the end, we kind of have to, unlike a lot of pieces of software out there that can sort of limit users to the point where they can't shoot themselves in the foot, we sort of need to like give them a gun license and a loaded clip and just like hope they don't shoot themselves in the foot. Like that's just like how our system works.
Don't some abuse filters stop bad edits from happening?
It's not really an error, and I think at some point, yes, it does like block it, or at least introduces more captchas and stuff. Or if you're not, I mean, I'll give you that. I think that there's some limit there. But this is like, that's a pretty severe escalation that we use to like protect ourselves from vandalism, which is really serious. I think that if you escalated the user experience like that for like, I was just trying to set the aspect ratio, like that might be perceived a little aggressive.
Right.
Okay, there's a couple more use cases in the reading section. I think some of them you can probably discuss separately because they don't directly impact the storage. There's a lot of API stuff like section, paragraph level editing. Does anybody want to talk about them, or should we move a little faster over those?
No, I mean, the only one I like to like kind of bubble up is like getting content separated more from styles, because we continually run into issues with content being styled for desktop browsers, and there's no clean way of like massaging that in some way. So for instance, like someone put like width 800 pixels on an element, and then it's like, what do you do in mobile? And like there's no way of like saying, okay, here's a media query for this that fits the difference.
So I don't know if this is captured in this list, but basically on this exact point, there is a lot of explicit layout instruction in Wikitext right now, and what we need to migrate toward is a more semantic description of the content and be able to infer from those descriptions, sort of enough meaning that we can then make choices based on the device to lay things out sensibly. And as long as we have people like setting the border in pixels or the width in pixels, right? Like that's a problem. But if we could have people say this is a lead image, this is an illustration, and even be able to say like this is an illustration of this sentence or this paragraph or something like that. That's more of a semantic relationship that then we can make smart choices based on the devices, whatever the consumer may be. I think that this is something that we've been talking about in Visual Editor a lot for a while, but we need to start getting more a broad like buy-in to this direction, and then like a bit of a roadmap around how we're going to get there, because there's probably a lot of different moving parts to make this happen. That's going to take years to get the corpus in shape to be able to do this. But if we don't do this, then the pile of hacks that we apply to our content to try and get it to look good on mobile, it's
we have a lot of
it just doesn't scale, and it's always going to make the mobile site a second-class citizen.
But I mean, I know it's really hard, but I mean, is this like something beyond Wikitext templates, or is it like do we start defining widgets? I mean, does anyone have an idea of what the
I think even if we could like get somewhere like towards it, like even if it's like a way of like marking a template as non-mobile friendly and then excluding it, that's something that's like a step in that direction. But I mean, somewhat related to the semantics, like a good example is navbox templates. They're not essential to the content. They're kind of interesting, but if you look at the Barack Obama page, for instance, they take up like half the HTML for it. They don't even render on mobile nicely, so we have to end up hiding them. There's no way of scrubbing them or like making them look nicer.
As Wikia has actually already done some work towards widgets. They have some kind of declarative XML, sadly, description of what kind of data items should be in info boxes, for example. So that works well for them because they have a lot simpler needs than we have. I think we have an expectation of your users being able to modify a lot of things and more control over things. Maybe that will be a challenge to deal with that. So it's probably easier to introduce some alternatives and then this is something you can use and it's nice because, rather than we take this away and
but I mean
we had to change the domain language. Like the whole thing is right now with Wikitext is partially semantic and partially like literal, right? And so we just have to try and keep edging out more and more of the literal stuff and moving into semantic descriptions of what the content means. And I don't think that we're in a position where nothing is semantic. It's just that we've let a lot of stuff slip as far as like letting people do like inline CSS. As far as people just sort of being able to like do templates with string output, like a lot of these things have kind of got us into a position where now we're going to have to give them a different tool, a different set of tools that allow them to express themselves in a way that like preserves their intention.
Yeah. And I think it's justifiable to start making these like tough decisions on mobile and say, look, we're not going to support this on mobile. From now on, this is where we're leading towards. It's going to take time. But I just worry about 2-year timelines where like we're just like waiting for this glorious future. Like it's far away. Like I want to start getting there quicker.
Well, okay. First off, if you just disable something on mobile, now mobile is a second-class citizen. And,
it already is.
and well, fine. And what I'm trying to suggest is ways to get out of that situation. Also, I don't know that you ever really need to wait for the glorious future. What you need to do instead is have both systems in place, so we can introduce semantic images, which people can use instead of existing images. And then the semantic images are beautiful and useful, and people will care about that, and they'll start preferring to use them. And then let the community choose when and how and where that stuff gets converted. But right now, we haven't given them a way to express themselves in a semantic way, so we can't like blame them for not doing it.
Sure.
Yeah, and we can do both simultaneously. You don't have to choose between the two. So we need to know far enough ahead of design the system, like what would semantic images, how would that work? And then we can introduce them, and then we can start letting people use them, and then eventually we could measure how many of the images are using one system or the other and sort of nudge them along or give them tools like bots to convert them or whatever.
I feel like the entire content, how do we evolve the content representation, that seems to be a very fertile discussion by itself. Like, that is kind of separate from the storage and change propagation. It's a little bit intertwined with the change propagation bit, especially. So if we had these standalone widgets that render X, then we probably have also gain an efficient way to update just this widget because we can control what it actually uses and what it affects. But I think beyond that, it might make sense to break out that discussion to a separate group almost.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about giving them the tools in the end. So we just had to kind of decide, make some wise decisions about those tools, make sure that they're in line with what the community's motivations and values are, and proceed. I mean, there aren't that many people who are going to use a hammer if you hand them a nail gun. Yeah. Like they're going to be happy about us giving them something that's really useful to them, but only if it's actually really useful. So we have to be careful to make sure that we do some research, really understand what it is that they're trying to do.
Yeah. So I mean, with the template issue, I think a lot of the problem is that a lot of editors don't realize that templates don't work on mobile for whatever reason. And I think even just like something small, like a small step in that direction, to say like this template is not mobile friendly, that would generate some interesting conversations around how to fix that. I think a lot of the issues come down to inline styles as dealing with the style stuff.
I think that, but I think again, like that's half of it.
Yeah.
The other is like, yes, okay, this isn't mobile friendly, but without saying, but here's this other tool that you can use that will meet all your needs and be mobile friendly. And until you have that, all you're doing is just saying you suck, and that's not going to go over well.
Yeah, but I guess, I mean, from my perspective, like it's sometimes hard to understand like where the issue, what they need, what the community needs, and it's kind of like that chicken egg problem. Like you can
never have to do research. We should actually listen to these people, ask them questions and crap. Not accusing you of not doing that, but I'm just saying like we can have. That can be part of the roadmap process, to, like first understand it.
Mm-hmm.
So John, like most of the issues are arising from template usage. Is that right? Like the stuff that's not
templates and inline styles, and There are numerous emails had discussed around that, and usually the response has been like, "Here's template editing, like, right, go and fix them."
So yeah, I mean, like moving templates to using structured storages, and then figuring out means to present that stuff on mobile is the place we need to get. The question is how to work with the community to actually make that happen. I know this is kind of like a generic question and statement, but that is where the challenge lies, right? Is largely fixing the template.
Yeah, but it's sort of education. It's like educating editors where templates are broken, educating us where we need to provide better tools for them to edit those where they can't actually fix them. And also, so like some kind of way of like users like being able to report like this template is broken. Like, so I mean, actually being able to identify like, where a template's being used on a page would be great from that perspective, because we could easily knock up a tool that, does this render well on mobile? Yes, no, like report somewhere this template has an issue, and then start doing stuff with that data.
Okay.
I don't know if that's in the realm of this, but
doable with like a little sample rate inclusion
It
and feedback tools and that kind of stuff.
is already possible partly with parsing information, but it's not reporting the nested templates. Right. So only the top level one. So you will know it's Netbox, but you will not know it's using this thing for the
Mm-hmm. That's the start.
It's definitely a start, especially it's a good idea for how to get the community engaged and helping solve the problem. But we need to make sure that the path of least resistance isn't growing the problem at the same time, because then we're just treading water.
Yeah.
We got 6 minutes.
Yeah, I think we should wrap up the use cases. I think the others, like Visual Editor, there's some work on the way there that I think is mostly under control. There's, I think, section editing that we touched on earlier. There will be some movement in that for next quarter, but the VE team is fairly small right now, so and depends a lot on Prosy too, so don't expect that to happen instantaneously.
Is the page, but the page metadata, is that, I mean, could that like address, oh, here's a lead image specifying widget, or is it, what were you anticipating page metadata possible?
The page metadata stuff is more about things like tags, categories to some degree as well. But right now that's all editable separately in VE, and the idea is to move more of this logic to the server side so that we can expose it as an API. So you can request, this is the metadata extracted as a JSON blob, and this is how I edited it. I sent back the modified JSON blob, and it's going to be propagated back into the wiki text and say.
Right, just injected. Yeah, wiki text. So again, like the wiki text is just the interface for wiki text and people who prefer to edit with wiki text.
And what he's describing is the solution to the status quo, which is, again, like you have to load the whole thing into memory. But what they're still doing that, they're just moving it to the server, which I think is really clever. Yeah.
But it opens up a gradual path towards having some separate editing, and we can experiment with that. Possibly we can come up with ways to maybe show wiki text editors, hey, you can also edit these things separately.
Right.
Whatever.
No, and we already have a bunch of things that we've developed, like what happens when you delete a category that was mid-content and then add it back in, and all these questions. Like, I think that we could proceed pretty quickly because you're basically just doing it in the server where we're already doing a client.
So I would like to use the last 5 minutes that we have to look ahead and see how we should organize this. I think that's so my impression of this discussion is that there's 2 main areas. I see that there's interest in the storage and change propagation part, and I think kind of disconnected from that or fairly independent is how do we evolve what is in the page, and how do we have these widgets. And that plays a little bit into the last point of the summary task, like which bits do we assemble in the end, and how are they defined, and how are they updated. And I could see if we don't want to have one big group that discusses all these topics all the time, maybe it would be more efficient to start 2 groups that organize around these 2 main areas and work on it.
I guess people can sort of self-select which ones they care about, because there can be crossover between the groups.
Yeah.
I want to point out one small thing. I'll be quick. I think it wasn't really mentioned, and there's a pain point that's not obvious unless you're in the analytics kind of part of the world. If you look at MediaWiki, it basically overwrites data. Like every time something's updated in a lot of pages, it overwrites the old record, right? It's not append only. You're not getting a full history if you look at the whole thing. So actually, for a lot of things, like for example, how pages move through categories, the only data we have that's historical are the dumps. What I would love for people to think about as we think about how we store things is transitioning to an append-only kind of store that lets you rebuild history at any point. This would make two obvious things very, very easy. Replication for us, we could just be a subscriber to something like a richer RC stream as opposed to trying to take snapshots of like a very hard to replicate store and getting larger every second. Sorry. And the second thing is the whole dumps generation. This year, for about 4 months, a lot of research was really stalled and blocked on the dumps not catching up. For example, report cards, etc., were down because that takes now, I think, over 3 weeks to dump the full history with a current approach, as opposed to just incrementally like adding whatever was appended since last time. So I just want you guys, it's really tangential, and I know it's a little off topic, but I think it's important for us to start thinking about that at some point. And that's it.
One important thing to realize in that context, which I realize is something we should have a proper discussion about later, but one thing I want to put out there just to begin with, nothing is ever going to be truly append only so long as we have oversight.
We do have suppression ability, so we can basically, the way it's implemented typically is to keep the data,
yes,
but you have extra data that stores the information that should not be shown, and then you check it.
But then you can't publish it. So in terms of public dumps, it won't technically be appendable.
We don't care about that right now.
The dumps process can filter stuff out.
It already does.
I think that's interesting. There's other things about, like, are we legally allowed to continue storing copywritten content? Some of it, there's all kinds of stuff that can be filtered out later.
All right. We need to wrap up, so we should make a plan for the next steps. Does it sound like a good idea to try to form 2 groups and to set up a follow-up meeting and to work out what exactly the problems are? Basically, based on this discussion, summarize this, create 2 tasks that break those out, and then have people subscribe to those, and then have a meeting for each of them.
Seems great.
Yeah.
That's good. I like the async collaboration abilities of that too. You know, people who couldn't make the meeting can still see what's going on. I would only suggest that, like, the notes from ongoing meetings, we always make sure that they make it in the Phabricator.
Okay.
Like, you're going to see these, so they'll be there, but yeah, you know, as we continue.
Yeah, maybe set up this Hangout thing for
right.
Cool. Okay. Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Thanks.
Here we go. Semantic content blocks. You should have piped up. So cool.